the last question from Bryce was about these invisible gatekeepers. Well, no one is more invisible than non-ISOs. And when it comes to most folks, they don't understand who they are, what they do, but they have a really big impact on what is developed, what is moved from one place to another. Missouri is so lucky to be right smack dab in the middle of two of them. It makes a lot of your work easy, I'm sure. But our next session will address this particular issue, both with representatives from MISO and SPP. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce Rich Heerdorn, apologies, Interim Chief of RTO Insight, Neil Robertson, Senior Engineer of Interregional Relations of SPP, and Ashley Whitmire, Director of Resources Utilization of MISO. Gentlemen, good to you, and Rich, take over.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Hope everybody can hear me okay. For those of you who are not familiar with us, RTO Insider has 3 publications. RTO Insider is the only media source that covers MISO, SPP, and the other 5 RTOs and ISOs in the US. We also publish ERO Insider, which covers the Electric Reliability Organization, NERC, 6 regional entities, including MRO and CERC. And our newest publication, Net Zero Insider, covers federal, state, and local efforts to address and adapt to climate change. Andy Whitmire is the Director of Resource Utilization at MISO. His team manages MISO's generator interconnection queue, as well as assessing a generator request for surplus replacement or retirement. And he started at MISO after graduating from Purdue University with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. Neil Robertson is the Senior Engineer of Interregional Relations for SPP. He primarily supports coordinated transmission planning activities between SPP and its neighbors. Neil served as an operations engineer at SPP from 2006 through 2019, supporting multiple functions, including reliability coordination, balancing authority, and market operations. So thank you for joining us, Neil and Andy.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. There's been much hand-wringing across the country about our inability to build new transmission to deliver remote wind and solar to population centers. But today, we want to talk about some good news, and that is MISO and SPP's joint targeted interconnection queue, which we'll refer to as the JTIQ study. This was the product of more than a year of work beginning in late 2020. MISO SPP evaluated 75 projects or mitigation portfolios and settled on 7 projects that would resolve 48 reliability constraints. It's expected to enable 11.1 gigawatts of generation in SPP and 17.5 gigawatts in MISO for a total of 28.6 gigawatts. That's more than a 10% increase for MISO, which has 157 in installed capacity, and also for SPP, which has about 95 gigawatts. The 2 RTOs are now working on a cost allocation formula, which they hope to submit to FERC by the end of this year, with RTO approvals of the JTIQ projects by the second quarter of 2023. So Neil and Andy, why did this project succeed where so many other prior efforts at planning have failed to produce interregional projects?
Well, unfortunately, we're not quite over the hump just yet, right? As you mentioned, we still have to get the cost allocation figured out in order to get these projects built. You know, I will say that the study is very successful in how it was performed and how we were able to come up with such a unique solution to this problem. You know, it really hats off to our CEOs who asked us to get together and think outside the box and come up with a study unlike what we've done before, which you know, gave us a kind of you know, a blank page on how we think we should study multiple generator cycles that are large range of generation that's representative in both the MISO and PQ, and kind of start from scratch as to how we might look at something between both of our regions. So it's we weren't prescribed to any one study as defined in our current JOA that sets our relationship up. We were given that opportunity to create something, and so the study was very successful in how we were able to perform a study, come up with a solution, and hopefully we could take it over the finish line and get cost allocation figured out.
I would just reiterate one particular element of what Andy said there, in that we started with a very ambitious objective for this effort, and we also started without any preconceived boundaries of the process we needed to follow to accomplish that objective. This JTIQ effort, as Andy said, started at the initiation of our CEOs respectively, and we pretty well were given a free hand in developing an approach to the problem that was unique and had not been attempted in prior regional planning efforts. So I think that factor in particular has made this effort unique and has led to the success we've had so far.
Well, thank you for that summary. Let me see if I can share my screen and give the audience an idea of the projects we're talking about. Most is disabled screen sharing, so never mind then. Can you guys, you mentioned that we're not over the hump yet, that now we get to the hard part, which is figuring out how to pay for these projects. As I understand it, you're looking at 3 different sources: MISO load, SPP load, and generation interconnection customers. What principles will guide cost allocation, and how optimistic are you that MISO and SPP will be able to reach an agreement?
I'd start by saying that, as far as principles, guiding principles, we're really trying to focus our initial analysis in the context of developing cost allocation methodology around beneficiaries of these projects. We continue the theme of the free hand in developing new and innovative solutions here. In general, I would characterize the underlying driving factors behind this JTIQ effort as barriers within the generation interconnection process. But in seeking new and innovative ways to come up with a solution, we brought our traditional economic planning arena into the conversation in the form of adjusted production cost savings to load is just one amongst many factors that we're trying to incorporate into the overall conversation on cost allocation. So, taking that approach and taking a hard look at beneficiaries in the context of this portfolio, I think it is going to enable us to take a new approach to cost allocation, bring parties to the table that necessarily haven't collaborated in this kind of way before, to come up with a cost allocation methodology that not only brings multiple parties together, but also distributes cost in a way that's generally reflective of the benefits these projects are going to present to the transmission grid and its users.
Yeah, and I'll take that one step further. It has to do with the type of planning that we've done as well. So, this is a generator interconnection study, right? So the purpose was to find projects that maximize generation interconnection. And so we want to, use that as kind of a guiding principle as who ends up paying for these projects. Well, who set the benefit? How did you determine who those benefits were? This project wasn't set out to look at what lines are going to maximize transfer between MISO and SPP. It wasn't set out to identify what lines are best to maximize economic dispatch in MISO and SPP. This study was set out to define what projects are going to help enable regeneration the best. Now we know that there are other beneficiaries other than just the generation that's going to be allowed to be enabled by these new lines. And so that's why we did incorporate economic analysis into the study and memorialize the report. And as we continue to flesh that out, what are the other benefits that we should consider as we determine this cost allocation structure?
Okay, thank you for that. As I understand it, the project has estimated adjusted production cost savings to MISO of 247 million. I'm sorry, 247 million for SPP and 724 million for MISO. And you've got an estimated cost of 1.65 billion. This was referred to as a planning level estimate. How is that estimate calculated?
We have set guidelines through each of our planning processes as to how we estimate the cost of new transmission. It's based on what voltage level it is, what the effective carrying capacity of it is. Is it new right of way? Is it greenfield? All of those go into our planning estimates as to what the cost of a new facility would be. And of course, we work with our incumbent TOs who own the existing right of ways and the existing substations where these lines are expected to connect on determining what that planning estimate is.
And there are now two projects that MISO has also included in its long range plan. I believe this is the Jamestown Ellendale project in North Dakota and Big Stone to Alexandria, or at least that's part of it in Minnesota. Is that correct, Andy? And how much would that take off potentially off the price tag? The JTIQ?
It would get down to about $1 billion. It's important to realize that as MISO and SPP were going about doing the JTIQ study, MISO had a parallel study effort internally looking at what transmission needs MISO needs across our entire Midwest footprint to reliably serve our load. So this study was really focusing on enabling generation interconnection. Our long-range vision plan was focused on how do we serve our load given the expected resource fleet in the future, looking at 20, 30 years out. That parallel effort identified both the Jamestown Ellendale and the Big Stone Alexandria line as being needed for not just serving load reliably through the LRTP study, but it was also showing benefit to generators through the JTIQ study. So great that this line was showing up in both studies. It certainly means that it's transmission that needs to be built now. And so then it came down to MISO deciding, well, which path should we try and get this line built? Should we work with SPP and try and get it built through JTIQ, or should we include it with the other lines that were part of our long-range mission plan? And MISO's decision was that that this line needs to be built now. It's needed to integrate generation. It's needed to serve our load. We see the benefits of this project now. Also, the benefits to MISO load outweigh the cost in and of itself. When you consider as part of the long-range vision plan, our business case shows that there is over a 2-to-1 benefit-to-cost ratio for that portfolio of projects to MISO load. So given the certainty around the cost allocation for LRTP, we'd already had that submitted. We submitted that to FERC back in 1st of February. We had already done all the planning, and we had better assurances that this line was going to be built. We decided to go ahead and move forward with including those two lines as part of MISO's long-range vision plan, meaning that once FERC approval is done on our cost allocation filing for our long-range vision plan, which is an update to MISO's multi-value portfolio or MVP tariff. Once that's done, now we still need to focus on how we can get the remainder of the JTIQ portfolio built, because those lines are still really important to enable the generation that we had modeled in our cases.
Thank you, Andy. I noticed only one of the 7 projects, this is the Ron project along the Nebraska-Iowa border, offers nearly equal benefits to both regions. The other 6 are heavily weighted to either MISO or SPP. Was that a surprise to you, and why did it shake out that way?
Well, I would say that you're just looking at the one measure of benefits in load APC. You know, as we continue to further analyze other areas of benefit, I would expect we would see you know, a more even distribution of benefits, like, for example, in the area of benefits to generator interconnection customers. Specifically in regards to your question about, you know, benefits in the form of load APC, you know, geography does play a significant role in that in general. In most cases, when you do the analysis, a project that is, you know, more or less physically located in the MISO footprint or vice versa in the SPP footprint, when you analyze that project in your models looking at economic benefit to load, you know, naturally it's a reasonable assumption to say that, you know, wherever the project physically resides is likely to be the majority beneficiary in terms of load APC. Of course, this doesn't always hold true, but in general terms, it does. But, you know, a project like the one you're referring to specifically right along the Nebraska-Iowa border, you know, when it straddles the border between the two regions, or it is a new tie line between the two regions, then it's a good general assumption that benefits are going to be closely split.
Have anything to add there, Andy?
No, other than one thing to know is when we did the economic analysis, you know, we did this having the MISO generation of the model serving MISO load and the SPP generation serving SPP load. So as Neil explained, you know, geography does come into play, and then it's going to, you know, those projects that are more in one RTO and the other are more likely to allow for a more economic distribution of that generation to serve its load. So the benefits end up, you know, being weighed towards one area towards the other just based on that geographic location.
Okay. Let me ask you a follow-up question on that. When you initially did the modeling, both MISO and SPP came up with fairly close approximations for how much additional generation would be freed up in SPP, but there was a big discrepancy in how the two of you perceived the impact in MISO, where MISO said it expected 17.5 gigawatts. SPP said it looked like it could enable up to almost 42 gigawatts. What was the reason for that discrepancy? And I understand that you decided to settle that by using MISO's estimate for MISO and SPP's estimate for SPP.
So in terms of the engineering behind this effort, MISO used its regional models to do its analysis. SPP used its regional models to do its analysis. We did closely coordinate on characteristics of these models, topology, generation additions, and things of that nature in regards to specifically studying JTIQ in the interest of meeting the study objectives. But again, I want to stress that this was not what, you know, in the planning world we would call a common model study. You know, we did not collectively develop a single model that both organizations performed analysis on. We leveraged respectively our regional models, our regional model development processes to come up with basically two sets of models that analysis is done on respectively by each organization. One of the outcomes of that is potentially what you described, is that, you know, when you perform some of the analysis, you may see various discrepancies between the results. And, you know, from one perspective, I would also look at that as a strength of the process, and using, you know, two sets of regionally developed models is you're basically doing two sets of analysis to, you know, compare and contrast results. But in regards specifically to the discrepancy you're describing in how the benefits were quantified in regards to amount of megawatts enabled to be interconnected, you know, we have analyzed that as far as, you know, why that outcome occurred. And one thing to highlight is MISO and SPP, you know, regionally each have procedures around how generation is dispatched within our planning models. And these methodologies are not necessarily consistent, especially in the way external generation is treated. For example, the way SPP treats MISO generation in the SPP model is certainly not identical to the way MISO treats SPP generation in the MISO model. So, you know, it's really a, you know, strength through coordination and, you know, comparing two different sets of analysis. And as you said, you know, in the interest of summing that to a single value that, you know, can be utilized within this process moving forward, we did use, you know, SPP's, you know, analysis of the SPP footprints, benefits, and MISO used MISO's analysis for the MISO region. And we summed those together to come up with a number that, you know, made sense and could be applied, you know, within this conversation moving forward.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, you know, the reason for the two models is because of speed, right? We were asked to do this within a year. So from conception to final report, it ended up to be about 18 months. In order for us to start with a single model, we would still be doing the analysis today. You know, we saw that in other interregional planning activities that it's best to utilize our own models. And then look for comparisons and commonality between those models on how we identify common needs and common projects for study. And so setting up those two individual models with a common set of common topology, a common set of generation, but allowing us to make our own assumptions as to how we should dispatch that. You know, MISO is good at dispatching your own generation. SPP is better at dispatching its own generation than MISO will. So, you know, having us have those different assumptions, it does give that, it helps give strength to the final solution that that there's the right projects in two different models. But because of simply having those different dispatches, you're going to have different loading on the common constraints and the common JTIQ portfolio. And so with that difference in initial loading is going to end up showing a difference in enablement.
Now, you began efforts to develop the cost allocation at a joint meeting last week. And I know one example you used talked about how you would determine whether a given generator interconnection would be allocated a cost here. So you used an example of a generator interconnection that has a 5% or greater defects impact on the portfolio could pay perhaps $35,000 per megawatt. So a 270 megawatt generator with a 10% defects, 10% impact on the projects would pay 27 megawatts times 35,000 or $945,000. Many people in this audience probably have never heard of what defects, what a defects is. Maybe you could explain to them how you're going to be going through this. That stands for solution-based distribution factor. Which one of you wants to weigh in on explaining that fine point of transmission planning?
I'll give it a shot. So in general, I would characterize defects, and there's numerous terms within the industry that get used to describe the same basic principles, but it's the measurement on a particular facility or set of facilities, how much of the output of a generating facility uses those facilities to serve the load, the subject load, whatever that load may be. So in that example, to extend upon it, it's basically saying that, you know, 10% of the energy crosses those facilities as it gets to its targeted load. And so within multiple planning processes in both the MISO and SPP region, we use a basic principle of a minimum threshold of impact to determine whether a facility or a generation interconnection request or, you know, any other characteristic within some of our planning processes is applicable to cost allocation or not. You know, for example, I believe within its generation interconnection process, and Annie can correct me if I get the number wrong here, but I believe they use a 3% defects cutoff, whereas, or excuse me, I believe SPP uses a 3%. Within the MISO process, they use a 5% impact threshold cutoff. to determine if a generator interconnection request is applicable to cost allocation on a identified upgrade within that process. And that general principle is applied numerous ways within multiple planning processes in both regions.
And that's a pretty common distribution factor for across the industry. You do that with TLR when you're doing curtailments of, at what point do you consider yourself to be contributing to a problem? And so that 5% is a pretty common standard. SPP does have a tighter standard. As Neil noted, they use 3%. But since MISO is using a 5%, we wanted to use that commonality. So certainly it's not as stringent as SPPs, but it's in line with what MISO uses and what a lot of industry RTOs use as their cutoff for saying, okay, now that you're contributing at least 5% of your flow to this constraint, you should be responsible for helping mitigate whatever that overload is because you've met that threshold.
Now, I understand that you're trying to balance between a subscription-based model and one in which load would initially pay for the projects and generation would reimburse it as it interconnects. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the principles we're trying to apply within our cost allocation methodology development is, sharing of cost as appropriate. The ultimate beneficiaries of these projects are in general intended to, provide a reasonable amount of the funding involved there. But within the business of transmission planning and then that propagating on into transmission construction, you have to take into account the fact that, especially when you're talking about generation interconnection processes and multiple generation interconnection customers being involved in the process, you may not necessarily achieve, 100% of the necessary funding, within one iteration of the generator interconnection process. So one of the principles we're trying to apply to JTIQ in regards to cost allocation is, you're having to incorporate both the generator interconnection processes of SPP and MISO respectively. And not only that, but we're trying to, with that goal in mind of beneficiary pays, we're trying to apply the cost allocation across multiple cluster studies of both organizations. We haven't really tried to project how many cluster studies collectively between MISO and SPP are likely to become applicable to this JTIQ cost allocation. We're quite a few unanswered questions between us and that point. But the idea of what we termed as critical mass in the last joint stakeholder conversation is the principle of ensuring that a sufficient number of generation interconnection customers are willing to pay a portion of this portfolio against the expediency of getting construction started and things of that nature, where another portion of the initial cost is borne by the load or potential other sources to get construction started. And then over time, the actual long-term beneficiaries of the facilities pay back in one respective way the cost, to ultimately distribute the benefit of the facilities to the beneficiaries in terms of cost allocation.
One thing that Neil mentioned was the idea that we could spread this cost across multiple cycles. That's what the beauty of this portfolio and of this study is, that we weren't tied to a single study. That's how our current queue process is designed. MISO will look at all the applications that came in one year. SPP will look at all the applications that came in one year and look at those as a cluster. And then we'll study the impacts of that one cluster on each other's systems. And the upgrade costs that have come out of those individual clusters has been high. And this was been driving a lot of generation to drop out of our queues, because that single cluster projects in those single clusters makes the economics too high for them to pay for that upgrade. The fact that we can look at multiple clusters, multiple generation across multiple future clusters, including generation that's not even represented in our queues yet, generation that we expect to come into our queues into the future. We can look at all of that generation together as a package. We're going to come up with transmission projects that are better long-term than just like what was the minimum project necessary to implement this small cycle. We're able to find projects that benefit a larger range of projects, are going to be cheaper in the long run. And also the solution will allow us to spread those costs across multiple cycles, thereby driving down the costs for all of those projects that are going to benefit from this portfolio of projects.
You mentioned cluster studies, and I noted that the study said that you're changing the queue priority from first come, first serve to first ready, first serve. Can you explain what that means?
So yeah, I'll take that one, Neil. So part of the study was not just to perform the study itself, but was, the charge from our CEOs was, hey, improve your processes, right? Let's work together better. On top of just improving your current processes, also figure out how to look at this issue of high transmission costs and how could you find projects and transmission, do a transmission study that looks more broadly, right? So, we talked this whole time about that JTAQ study that we've done. The other part of the initiative was look at process improvements. One of the major problems with FERC, and the way our tariff determines queue priority now is by application date. So when projects come into SPP's queue and they come into MISO's queue, that sets the priority, right? So it's first come, first serve. So the projects that come first, they either get the benefit of utilizing whatever capacity is left in the system, or they get the detriment of being assigned the first set of upgrade costs. Well, because of the speed at which we both have been processing our queue and our queue backlogs, MISO is currently processing applications that came in our 2019. It came in the year 2019 and 2020. SPP is still processing requests that came in 2017. So because those projects in 2017 came first, they have a higher priority than MISO's 19 and 20 queue cycles. Well, what about 18? So SB hasn't even started their 2018 queue yet. But yet MISO has projects already in GIA from 2018. So it doesn't make sense for our projects to be held up by the projects in SPP's queue that still haven't been studied yet. So we said, what's a better way to set up queue priority? So we decided that it's best if we have a very similar process. We both have this 3-phase DVP process. Ours is called the definitive planning cycle, or definitive planning phase, and SPP's is called the DICES study, but it's similar, it's the same process. So instead of doing an application deadline, let's set it up as the start of phase 2. So, we've already had projects drop out of phase 1, so the projects that are left in our queue are more likely to continue to stay in. And so let's set the application deadline or the queue priority as that date. And that will certainly improve our process. And so we're going from this first come, first serve to first ready, first serve. And so we hope that once FERC approves that, we'll be able to implement that. And then practically how that looks is as SPP continues to process the projects that came into their 2017 queue, they expect to finalize those later this summer. And then once that's done, then they'll be able to process the MISO 2018 and then the MISO 2019 and likely even MISO 2020 queue cycles. And so they'll be able to work through that backlog sooner based on which projects are farther along in their queue cycle. So that's going to be a great benefit for both MISO and SPP customers. So SPP customers aren't being held up and MISO customers aren't being held up.
Do you want to add anything on that, Neil?
No, I believe Andy covered it well. It's, the defining principle there is, based on the complexities of the generation interconnection study process and the multiple decision points that customers have within the processes, we just felt it was appropriate to evolve beyond the principle of, whoever jumped in line first is necessarily going to establish a higher queue priority than others who are willing to make decisions, produce financial commitments and advance themselves through the processes. So that's all I'd like to add.
Okay. What has generally been the response from generators to this process? I know that you mentioned at the Friday meeting that you're really looking for a stakeholder-driven input on the cost allocation, but specifically for the generators to whom this may be a boon, have they seen it as such? Are they encouraged, or are they concerned that, well, now you're changing the rules and this may slow things up?
I will say first off that the generation interconnection customers amongst our stakeholders have been very supportive of this effort in general. Now, of course, I would say that they are generally apprehensive of, this cost allocation methodology development. But as we work through this process, I think generation interconnection customers are very cognizant of the overall goals we're trying to achieve, which is enabling megawatts to interconnect to the system that have thus far been unable to because of these cost prohibitive upgrades that the generation interconnection processes have previously been identifying, and specifically the way those processes currently assign cost. So I feel like generation interconnection customers look at this study and the cost allocation methodology development effort that goes along with it as an excellent opportunity to enable some opportunities for them that they previously have not had when it comes to looking at the result of the interconnection process and the cost of the upgrades that are being identified there.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think that they have been optimistic. They're appreciative of the study efforts. They think that the study has promise. Their concerns right now are just that they want to make sure that whatever costs are being allocated, that it's worth their costs. And so that's where we're really that they've been focusing on the detailed questions we've been getting about enablement. Is that they just want to make sure that they're going to get what they pay for.
Fair enough. I would think anyone would be in that situation would have that expectation. Let's talk about one other challenge in actually getting steel in the ground, and that's transmission siting. We've seen major projects in New England get shot down by local opposition. For example, a project that would bring Canadian hydropower down to Boston was shut down by voters in Maine in November. That's still subject to potential court challenge, but it does not look good for that project at this point. What is the atmosphere in SPP and MISO states for new transmission development? Is there a big likely to be a big challenge to any particular one of these projects?
I'll start with what I can share from the SPP perspective there. First off, I feel like MISO and SPP both have been very successful in recent years getting a significant amount of transmission expansion projects built. I can't say that it's necessarily been without its bumps in the road, but we have shown a consistent track record of its success over the last, let's say, decade or more of getting transmission expansion, whatever the source of the particular project was, getting a lot of that stuff built. Specific to this portfolio we're discussing in regards to JTIQ, we mentioned it in our last stakeholder meeting, physically, a significant majority of these projects, physically reside in states that have right of first refusal laws. So obviously we'll have to account for that as we look to, getting the projects actually constructed. That plays a key role in the process of, siting and construction. So some of the projects are not going to physically reside in states with right of first refusal laws. So, Order 1000 implications are still at play in the conversation in some context. We're just starting to start down the path of answering the detailed questions around, how we're going to get these projects constructed. and we're basically starting. We progressed thus far in our cost allocation conversation through the big picture ideas of sharing costs between beneficiaries and those types of conversations. But we have a number of conversations ahead of us, in getting to a complete cost allocation methodology and accounting for the nuances around actually getting these facilities sited and constructed is certainly going to be a prominent component in that conversation.
Andy, do you have any thoughts on the issue of siting and how it's likely to play in MISO?
No, I think Neil covered it well. Those are still questions to answer. Certainly ROFR will play a big part in the current siting of a lot of these projects. We would like to first focus more on how we get these lines paid for versus eventually how we get them built. Let's not put the cart before the horse.
Yes, and for those in the audience who may not be familiar with the right of first refusal, FERC's Order 1000 required the removal of federal rights of first refusal, meaning that incumbent transmission companies get the first dibs on building any projects within their territory. But it did not impact states, and many states have enacted these so-called ROFR laws. Let me ask a somewhat move to a somewhat different topic. And this question is for you, Andy. MISO just had their planning resource auction last week, and all of the Midwest zones cleared at the cost of new entry, or $240 a megawatt day. That's an indication of a need for new capacity. MISO had said it had no plans to look for new transmission to deal with the transfer limit between MISO South and MISO North, or Midwest. But stakeholders, I understand last week, in light of the study results or the auction results, asked them to take another look at that. Can you talk about, Andy, what MISO's current thought is about doing anything about that bottleneck between the two MISO regions?
Yeah, we've certainly always had plans to look at north to south as part of our LRTP plan. We had originally planned it to be part of, say, Tranche 4. We can look at how if we pull that trigger and move that forward. But regardless of when we do that planning and look to get it built, any new transmission that's going to increase the transportability or the contract path between MISO North and South is still years away. And so that's not going to be an immediate fix for the PRA results that were published last week.
Are you likely to accelerate the planning for that in light of the results?
That's still being discussed.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious, given the success that you've had thus far in the JTIQ and actually getting to an agreement on projects, we know we're a long way from the finish line, but has this gotten the attention of other RTOs? Have you been getting calls from PJM or other areas about how you're going about this? And do you expect that this will have kind of spillover effects into other regions?
I don't know if it's necessarily from JTIQ in particular, but certainly, the ANOVA hit on the need for longer range emission planning. SPP, PGM are doing that. And as we know that the renewable portfolio trend will continue across all of our footprints, the need to transfer power between us is going to be important, right? And that during Winter Storm Uri last February was certainly a big indicator of that between MISO SPP, right? So the need for more interregional planning, I think, is on everyone's radar. A question we get asked a lot is MISO kind of doing a similar type of setup with PJM? Right now, no. We see us coordinating more through our long range mission plan. What made the JTIQ important was because of past upgrade costs that we've seen we have effects some studies between MISO and SPP. We haven't seen those types of high costs in effects studies in, say, when studying projects in MISO South footprint or studying projects along the MISO PJM footprint. So the need to really unlock transmission, unlock generation in MISO and SPP's footprint in the states identified around the JTIQ project is really what drove us to look at that area and to select these projects.
Great, thanks for that. Well, we're just about out of time, but I did want to mention to the audience that there is something else happening this week to keep your eye on, which is FERC will be has on its agenda for its Thursday meeting ruling potentially in its advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, which it opened back in July of last year. To reconsider transmission planning, cost allocation, and generator interconnection rules. So the sand could be shifting under our feet here as we speak. There anything in particular that you guys are looking for that either of your RTOs is hoping for out of this process?
You know, of course, the ANOPR has generated a lot of buzz in the industry overall, and of course SPP as well. I wouldn't say that that SPP necessarily has any expectations or has any objectives we're hoping are met with the potential NOPR that's coming. But I believe your general assertion there is correct that this could potentially be very impactful to multiple planning processes.
Any closing thoughts, Andy?
Yeah, I'm not saying that we're looking for any one thing. I think our concern is that we really are focused on our long-range vision plan and getting it approved by our board in July. And so, that's really where our focus is, and not necessarily concerned about what may come out of the NOPR. We want to be able to get through this last hurdle of LRTP and focus on getting JTIQ across the board, and then we'll see what comes out of the NOPR and what's next.
Okay. Well, with that, we will close this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all very much. Does anybody have any questions? There is one question, if you wouldn't mind staying on.
Sure.
Thank you. John Stevens, City of Julius, Springfield, Missouri. Josh mentioned during his introductory comments that Missouri was fortunate that we have customers in both RTO regions. However, he didn't mention that a large portion of the state is also served by in a non-RTO area owned by cooperatives. And I was just curious your thoughts, I guess on a two-part basis. Number one, does that area in any way considered in the JTIQ? And if not, do we leave something on the table if we're not considering that area or not having them participate in this study?
I'm sure, John. This is Neil Robertson. I can take that. I wouldn't say that the JTIQ considered co-op facilities or the co-op operated portion of Missouri in the study itself. And part of that is I don't know that the prior generation interconnection studies, both on the MISO side, the SPP side, and their associated affected system studies, necessarily identified consistently a need in that area. First of all, I would say that if it had, we would have probably put more effort into making this, incorporating those entities into this effort. So on the backside of that, I would say that, if this study identifies projects or had identified projects, let me say, or other, significant impacts, to the areas you're referencing, I think we would have certainly reached out and engaged with those folks to get their input in this process. So I would say all that just to say that, you know, I think MISO and SPP, you know, do a good job of engaging with non-RTO neighbors. And, you know, we will certainly continue to do that as we work through not only this process, but other coordinated planning efforts in the future. You know, we're always looking for good opportunities, you know, to engage additional parties in these processes. I think the more you engage, you know, all the impacted parties in any potential planning effort, the more successful you can potentially be.
Yeah, I second that, Neil, and it goes to my last comments was, you know, we hadn't seen historic congestion around ACI or the other cooperatives in Missouri, similar to how we, you know, MISO's and SPP steam goes all the way into Arkansas. We haven't seen historic congestion around there. So we didn't focus a lot of effort in that area because we haven't seen historic congestion that's been preventing generation interconnection in those parts of our footprint. We wanted to focus on the areas where we have seen historic congestion that has limited the ability for generation to come online. And so that's where we spent in our effort. And had we seen congestion in those other areas, as Neil said, I think we would have brought those folks in to participate in such a study.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Gentlemen, have a great rest of your day. Thank you for presenting today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is the last session of the day. Want to thank Travis and Emmy, both MEI staff who without this definitely would not have happened. Thank our sponsors and you, obviously our attendees, for participating. There will be a survey. This is our first hybrid. Please feel free to give us your thoughts, both positive and negative. We are trying to learn to see if this is something that you all want and has value to it. We are expecting to do another hybrid in August 16th in Columbia, Missouri, focused on energy efficiency, and one in December 8th or 9th, I can't recall now, 8th in St. Louis, focused on energy-related economic development. So hopefully you find those interesting. You'll be able to participate. Unless you really like the name tags, go ahead and keep them. If not, go ahead and put them in the box on the way out. There's a little barcode, which is what you'll take to get out of the parking lot. And if there are no other announcements from Travis, again, thank you, Travis and Harvest. We know it wasn't the greatest audio part, but really do appreciate it. Appreciate the questions. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day and safe travels.